Thank you everyone for joining us, and especially Nnenna and Stephanie, thank you for being here with us. So these kind of events, these encounters with authors that we do is mostly that we are very keen to form this kind of community with authors that have similar interests as Wimblu, because as we often say, we believe, that stories have this ability to bring us together. They form this sort of collective imagination, and they kind of create a refuge where we can connect with other people and with the world. And so this is why we set out to create these spaces of community around our stories. And with these encounters in particularly, we are looking to delve deeper into the themes that each story explores, learning about the people who created them, and also the creative processes involved and the worldviews from which each story is created. So just to go into it, our guests today are Nnenna Onuoha. She's a ghana-nigerian researcher and artist based in Berlin. Her research explores monumental silences surrounding the histories and afterlives of colonialism across West Africa, Europe, and the United States, asking, how do we remember? Which pasts do we choose to perform, and why? She is the director of the short film Lagos, a story that is part of our 7th edition, where she explores the unequal history of movement between Nigeria and Portugal, Africa, and Europe. And then our second guest is Stephanie Spray. She is a filmmaker, anthropologist, and educator whose work lies at the intersection of ethnography and art, with research interest in social aesthetics, visual sonic, and media anthropology, conservation, climate change, and the anthropology of science and everyday religious practices. She co-directed Manakamana, a documentary featured in our volume's column, written by Luciana Gallegos. And both of our guests were at some point members of the sensory ethnography lab at Harvard University as well. So welcome. As the title of our event says, today we're going to be rethinking movement through creative documentary. And I'll just dive in with the first question so that we can kick it off with the with the conversation. So yeah, our this edition's theme is movement, as you know, and both of your documentaries address this theme of movement, but you solve it in different ways. Lagos is about this unequal movement of humans from one continent to another, and it conveys how these processes of European colonization in Africa remain open to this day, right? And water is the medium that you choose, Nnenna, to convey this movement. It's the medium through which this movement happens, and also water becomes sort of a witness narrator of the slavery dynamics that happened and that still occur between Portugal and Nigeria. On the other hand, we have Manakamana, which is, in this case, invites us to reflect on pilgrimage, so another kind of movement, and also like looking at it through time and like how it looks in modern times. But the way you solve it is that you're anchoring the camera in a single position for 118 minutes and inviting the viewers to explore a whole reality, just by appealing to their imagination, to their attention, to senses that are other than the visual. So somehow the journey from one place to another in search for something, which is in itself a pilgrimage, is transferred to the viewer. So taking into the account that the nature of cinema is, moving image, how do you see this relationship between movement as a theme and movement as form? And maybe I'll pass it on to Nnenna first, and then we can listen to Stephanie.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks for having us for this conversation. Okay, so movement as a theme and a form. I think for me, actually, like the theme of movement, I had that first. So I knew I made this around 2018, 2017, when I was in Lisbon at the time. It was like my final semester of film school. And I wrote a bit in the like accompanying text to the film, but living in Portugal as somebody who's from Ghana, Nigeria, I was feeling this kind of bubbling frustration with how I would encounter stories about Africa in my daily experience from my landlords, from my professors when I went to the bank, etc. And so I just had the sense that kind of I was frustrated by the narrative that was being told, and that I wanted to process it by making something else. And eventually ultimately came to this idea, you know, that there are many different stories of these travels, and maybe I could put them together and have this be like, use the device of a travelogue and people going back and forth and telling their story. Because it seemed to me like, yeah, if we had kind of the multitude of stories, then people would tell without me kind of hitting them over the head with it, that the story that we were hearing in Lisbon wasn't, one wasn't the only one, but also we would see how much it had been fluffed up in a way. And at the time, I had just started kind of also playing with this idea of making films that had a lot of voices and talking. I think I still do that, but maybe less so. And so it was, I kind of had done the research and had like put the stories together, but I wasn't sure how the film would look. And so one helpful thing that someone had told me a couple of like films before this one was just to listen to it, since I had always had so much text to listen and imagine like, how does this sound like it looks? And yeah, so in a way, like the theme of movement informed my decision about the aesthetics of it. So they were all stories of people traveling, with the exception of mine, which happened by plane. Most of the journeys had happened on the ocean and by sea. And so, yeah, that led to the decision, I guess, that these should happen on water and that I would show water. And so the film then is mostly like shots of water. It's mostly scenes underwater or once in a while through fog. And this is kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I would say, I guess, within the universe of my film, that there absolutely is a relationship between form and theme. And I guess I started with the one and got to the other. Yeah.
Thank you, Nnenna. That's very interesting to know that for you, sort of like the form emerged out of the theme. Yeah, that's nice. I really like what you said about listening and imagining, you know, that you listen to the film and then you imagine how to solve it. Yeah. Stephanie, how about you?
Well, actually, Nnenna's description of how she came to make this film was really helpful for me, because I was reminded also of the origins of the film, which were actually had nothing to do with the cable car, but were also born from a sense of frustration or a sense of stasis, the opposite of movement. In fact, and this is maybe thinking ahead to maybe something we'll discuss later, but a lot of the work, I mean, the film was a part of, at least for me, and I worked with my collaborator, Pacho Velez, on this film, and we both brought we have different perspectives on this film. But for me, this arose out of over, I think, 8 or 9, 10 years of work in Nepal. And a lot of it was with the same people that you see in Manakamana, but I've been filming with them in villages. And their lives are very much hemmed in by, they themselves can't travel much, or if they travel, it's by bus. But in part, they're not allowed much movement or in much mobility because of poverty, right? They can't take they can't take pilgrimage very easy. In many ways, the film did pay for their passage. And I'd heard a lot about this pilgrimage to Manakamana. I'd heard also about the cable car, because at the time it was the only cable car in Nepal, which is a mountainous country with these vast hills in advance of the mountains that would be traveled by foot. So going back to movement, the desire to make this film was in part to fulfill their desires to go on pilgrimage, but also because I realized it would be liberatory for me as a filmmaker. It would be a different space, one in which people would be taken out of the everyday requirements to work another person's land or to travel by foot, playing their musical instrument, asking for money. But it would be another kind of space, another kind of experience. So going back to the film itself, in Manakamana, everyone is you're either going to this temple or you're returning from. And so for many people, they're traveling as supplicants. They're going with a request to the goddess. They're asking for something. But for others, it's an opportunity for just to go, to see the goddess, but also to take this trip in this cable car. So in the film, you see all kinds of passengers, right? But I think what I think is so wonderful about cinema as a space for seeing this is it's very ephemeral, right? Pilgrimage, any kind of experience that we have, and that the cable car itself also allows for a space of reflection, not only on what you might wish to ask for from the goddess, but also on the landscape to be transported above. And I think one theme that recurs in the film is commentary on the landscape, on what they see passing by, and yet the viewer themselves aren't able to see fully the landscape except from behind. So I think that if anything, I'm hoping that it's a kind of contemplative space for certainly thinking about pilgrimage, but also about passage and about time. So if anything, what my hope is that yes, the film's also it's certainly about Nepal and it's about pilgrimage, but it's also about the experience of cinema itself, which is ephemeral. You know, it's something that you can never hold in your hand like an object, right? It just passes through and then you have these memories. And I think that's reflective of pilgrimage itself. And also it allows a space for people to think about the changes in the landscape. You hear a lot of reflection on that. So it's about the movement, certainly the movement of bodies, but I'm hoping it's also about change and offers a kind of space of reflection for the viewer. So movement as a theme and movement as a form, it's a wonderful and open question. I think that if anything, it's maybe not what I thought of initially, really. The film itself grew out of an affection for place and people, but it's wonderful that through that it can be so many other things for the viewers.
I love the way you describe it, because I definitely think that the film has this effect that it becomes also sort of like a movement of the mind, you know, that you're traveling with the participants, but you're also traveling in your inner landscape, you know, because of this sort of duration and contemplative look. Yeah, I really resonate with that. Yeah, it's really nice. And it's good to mention, like, I had never thought about it, that you create sort of a journey for the viewer, but you also created a journey for your participants, you know, and this might be overlooked in a way, but this participatory approach to your film, that it created this opportunity for movement for them as well. That's really nice that you brought it up. And I think both your answers bring me to our next question, which has to do with the narratives, you know, that you're trying to change in a way. You both mentioned like a frustration with the narratives, right? Or like a frustration with the representation. And I think that both your films work on that, you know, they reconfigure the dominant narratives of movement they address. In one case, one seeks to bring us closer to these new pilgrimages, or to a revision maybe, or as you were saying, like a reconsideration of what pilgrimage looks like, not just today, but in the cinematic experience. While the other appeals to a critical revision of the colonialist historic discourse of forced movement between Africa and Europe, and which still takes place today, really, between the global South and North, maybe not under other conditions, but still happens. But one other thing that you share in common is that you're both anthropologists. So I'm curious, what were sort of like the anthropological intentions behind these documentaries, and what findings can you share? And also maybe why did you choose film as a way to talk about these issues?
I can start. I mean, I think part of the difficulty is maybe that I'm a reluctant anthropologist. Okay, but I guess thinking about the narratives that I wanted to shift and what the intentions were with the film. I mean, I mentioned some of that in my first answer. I think another part that was important to me, or that anthropology has brought to me, maybe let me focus on the positive, was that there was a lot of there's a lot of obsessing about subjectivity and a lot of obsessing about like what position you are looking at something from or discussing something from. And so another layer of my frustration had been that both with anthropology and with film, but there's the thread of kind of who is doing the writing about the world and who's being written about. And so it was important for me just to play with that a bit and to mess with that a bit. And maybe this leads into my selection of film, even though there are a lot of books that are written with multiple subjectivities, but I felt through film I'm able to have like not a million, but like a lot of different voices and different characters that bounce off of each other and that interrupt each other and that contradict each other. So that's been kind of one thread of the experience for me and one thread of the choice for me. And then also, of course, also being mindful of, what it means for myself to be one of the voices, which you hear in the end of the film, and to disrupt, again, this kind of big nationalist Portuguese narrative of discovery, etc., that we have in the film. I guess another thing that I had done was one of the first stories you hear comes from this chronicle of the discovery of Guinea, it's called, that was written about the discoveries, and it tells the tale in the 15th century of these ships that set off and what they find. And I was also frustrated with the idea that because this had been kind of written down and published as a book, it's seen as authoritative and as history. Because elsewhere in the book, they're talking about kind of seeing these ocean monsters and fighting them. And for me, that's not less real or no less mythological because it's printed in a book in old Portuguese. And so another thing that I had done, and which anthropology lets us to do, is not just to look at the past of like what has happened, but to question kind of how do we think of the past, etc. So it just drove my thinking of kind of if these mythologies about fighting sea monsters, etc., are seen as part of the Portuguese history, then why wouldn't I also include kind of Nigerian history and mythology, which may not have been written down, but which I've heard through stories. So, for instance, there's this figure called Mami Wata, who is like a sea goddess or spirit, depending on where you're speaking from. And she's believed to live in the water and specifically to be interested in luring greedy men off the ships and into her water. And so it stands to reason that at this time when there were a lot of boats going back and forth, trading people, that she would have been particularly active and she would have seen things. So another thought that I had is kind of why among my group of travelogues who are telling the story about what happened on the ocean between the two cities, kind of why wouldn't she be a voice, and why is that any less real than Gomes Inês de Azura, who wrote this book about the journey. So I'm kind of mixing, I guess, my choice of anthropology and film, but I do that a lot, so I think it's fitting. But yeah, for me, film worked just as a way to kind of layer the voices over each other. And also, I'm sure Stephanie will get into this, but there also is kind of also a long history of anthropology and film, and anthropology and cinema, and other forms of art. So now anthro is maybe more officially text heavy, but there always were people who kind of wrote and drew or made charts or films, etc. So it was also part of my history of coming through film, kind of through anthropology. Yeah. So they are bound, but this is why I put them together.
Yeah, this is lovely, Nnenna. Everything that you're mentioning about the multi-layered voices, it really comes out. And now that I think of it, it relates to Manakamana as well, you know, that you have like these characters and multi-layers and different voices, sort of telling like the same story again and again, but from different perspectives. Yeah. So this is really nice. And I think it puts, you speak about subjectivity, but there's also a thing about intersubjectivity, right? Once you put those voices together, and that I think it's what emerges from the landscape of the film itself, and not from one or the other, but it's like an emergent property of putting these things together. Yeah. Stephanie.
Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned intersubjectivity actually at this moment, because my history, I think, is somewhat similar to Nnenna's, in that I had been thinking of myself, or imagining not myself as an ethnographer, but as someone who did ethnography. So I couldn't claim for myself, I couldn't claim that I was an anthropologist. I wasn't trained as one for the longest time. But when I came to anthropology, it was through filmmaking. And specifically what led me there was the work of anthropologists who were writing after, thinking about and writing about intersubjectivity and trying to experiment in text and or in the methods that they brought to their field work, about how could they move beyond like this kind of this dichotomy between myself and my informants out there, but how can I bring my body into this space? And there are a number of examples that come to mind, but nonetheless, this really appealed to me, and cinema and film seemed to be the perfect medium for exploring this, specifically because of the potential for exploring and exploiting ambiguity in the work, which I'm really glad Nnenna brought this up, because there is a very long history of visual anthropology and making films, but the forms that they often took were in many ways kind of servicing a model of the essay or following a thesis. Like there's a hypothesis, a question that you're exploring, and you're going to demonstrate this through the film. And I think that at least the way, and this is, I think, a commonality that Nnenna and I share, we're interested in exploring these other spaces, maybe more asking questions than answering questions. So going back to the reluctant anthropologist, I too, so I came to anthropology through filmmaking and entered an anthropology program, a PhD program, through cinema. So for me, they've never been separated. However, what I would say, going to your original question about kind of the anthropological intentions, I was very much interested in challenging ideas of Nepal as a kind of Shangri-La, as a kind of space for spiritual, hyper-spirituality, or a pure kind of spiritual place where the Tibetans and Nepalis are elevated above us. I mean, it's just horrific, right? It's dehumanizing. And so I was interested in showing, contemporary Nepalis. Also, pilgrimage is something in which you would eat ice cream, or you would take, selfies. I mean, the film is now 10 years old, which is amazing to me, but it's, and it's, Nepal's changed so much since then. But that was an interest to me. I think the other thing I would want to say, though, and thank you, Nnenna, for speaking positively about what anthropology brings, because now I work with a lot of artists and I work with a lot of anthropologists in my role as a professor. And I think the thing I really love about anthropologists doing film is there's a patience that they bring and a commitment to place, that they're willing to spend years on a project, years, not just, a few months here and there. There's a kind of commitment there that's embedded in the discipline itself. So I think that that's something I would like to highlight as a positive side, as a kind of trait that anthropology at least values and gives at least lip service to. And I think a lot of people do that work. They spend years at a site or with people. So yeah, I think I'll end with that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, like the way that you both are presenting it, that sort of taking out of both worlds, you take the cinema language, and this gives you some licenses, some imaginative license, some speculative licenses, and then you can bring this into your approach or your exploration. But then this that you mentioned, Stephanie, about this patience, I think this is so important, right? That and this sort of like observational quality to anthropology, that it's not just patience, but I would add that it's sort of like non-judgmental, it's like you're trying to observe the world without, putting the labels right up when you see it, maybe it's a work that you do, as you say, later when you're analyzing and you're creating these like anthropological theories and everything. But when you're doing the ethnography, it's more about just opening up to the world. And I think this is sort of like the quality that I find in both your films in a way. And brings me to the next topic, which is about contemplation, and observation. And because I think that both your films have this quality, you resort to contemplation as a structural element for the stories in one way or another. In your film, Stephanie, with each passing minute, this duration causes gestures and like just very faint sounds emerging from the subjects and other like very ordinary details. They become highly relevant and almost like events, within the simplicity of the film. And it's what you were talking about, the fact that you are challenging what does spirituality look like, and you make it look like a very ordinary thing, like in the best of sense, that it's not something different from ordinary life. And in Lagos, you have these images of the water, which are like so mesmerizing, and like this whole mythological atmosphere, Nnenna, that you bring into the film. And the seabed takes us out of just a human discourse to remind us that there's a living landscape there where just human and non-human dramas take place. So, and one thing that I would like to underline is that the very act of turning to contemplation as a narrative element in our times, and especially in this side of the world in which we're overcome by distractions, it feels almost like a subversive act, Actually, Luciana writes in our column a very nice line. I'm just going to quote her. She says that, well, like through this kind of observational cinema, our attention is recalibrated through formal devices, and suddenly we notice details that in another setting we would ignore, or we elevate the dramatic weight of the everyday. And I think like both your films are kind of working through that. But would you say, well, Stephanie, you kind of said it already, but would you say that your films are deliberatively contemplative or seeking this recalibration of our attention? And also, what is your own take on observation and contemplation as a way to relate to the world? Yeah. Maybe we give it again to Nnenna.
Sure, I can start. So observation and contemplation. I think I also made this a while ago, and I think watching it now, I'm seeing also how, as a graduation film from a program in documentary cinema, like I can see a lot of the demons I was fighting. And I think one of them had been like a specific understanding of documentary that was that it involved finding one person and like getting their deepest, darkest trauma and like filming that, and filming intimate moments, etc. And that was the film. And I won't go into why exactly, but something about that I didn't want to do. And so I think I was also interested in contemplation in the sense of like making a film that was still close to human issues, but that you could make more broadly in a way. So without kind of, in a way, violating somebody's privacy just for the sake of making a film, and without kind of, and these films are great and I admire them sometimes when they're made, but I think that just requires a level of aftercare that as a student doing a graduation film, I wasn't able to do. So I think I was interested in contemplation in the sense of, okay, how can you still talk about something big that's happened, in a way, starting from myself, so something that is affecting my everyday experience in Lisbon. And that also, it was me and people I had run into. So there's also the story of somebody who stows away on a ship and ends up in Portugal, who was a barber in Lisbon that I had made a previous film with. So it was also kind of a way to tell his story without necessarily having to like shine my like camera microscope on him, you know, and talk about his kind of traumatic crossing into Europe. So yeah, for me, this idea of contemplation of like, okay, I've done the research, I will find a bunch of stories, and I will present them to the viewer to kind of watch and think and contemplate for themselves, was an interesting experiment. Yeah, and a way to look at this issue, but also to look at what do I want to do with cinema and what can I get the viewer also to do with me. So in that sense, I would say, yeah, observation and contemplation did play a big part.
Yeah, I also think that there's in the process, what you're doing is also sort of a recalibration of attention, you know, that you're, like you were mentioning before, you know, you're saying like, let's pay attention to these other stories as well. And then you create this formal space for you to like come to your own conclusions in a way, like you're not necessarily telling people what to think, but you're creating the space where the viewer can sort of like find the pause and like the elements to look at things differently, which I think it's magnificent. Yeah.
This question is so wonderful and it's so insightful. If anything, I would say Manakamana is certainly about contemplation. If anything, the film itself, the first two shots, there's no conversation. That's why you have lone writers. The film didn't have to start that way, but the idea was that the film itself would train viewers into, I guess, as you said, recalibrating their attention to attending to just what they were seeing, what they were hearing, and not, I guess, pandering to the, you know, the desire or the need that's been inculcated into us by a lot of cinema, which I love, by the way, but that's heavily narrative based, in which, or based on dialogue that carries you through time, and just to encourage people to submit to the ride itself, just as the passengers were. I was going to say also that for me, at least, this film was about portraiture. It was really about the individuals on the rides. For the most part, for me, they were very dear and important to me. And I had spent a lot of time with them or their families. And I wanted, in the same way I was remembering like Andy Warhol's screen tests, in which people are just, I mean, they're much shorter, right? They're a minute or so long, but people are looking at the camera, and there's something monumental about that and something important. And I wanted to give that time to look. And I think that was important for both Pacho and I as we were making the film, that people learn to be patient so that when they do speak, it has greater weight than it might otherwise. Like you said, the small things, the small observations, or the things that you hear, the things that happen, have a greater art, feel event worthy, even if they're everyday. So I think I would say, though, going back to the idea of observation and thinking about the observation, certainly in anthropology as well, and in cinema. And of course, for anthropologists, there's a observant participation, right? So you're not just an observer, you're also participating, your body's there, you're acknowledging your own role in that space and what you contribute to that. And I think in Manakamana, that's something also we didn't shy away from. You hear the camera rolling. At one point, people look at the second rider, Bindu, accidentally kicked me, and she looks over and smiles. But she knows, normally she would apologize because you don't touch people with your feet. And she almost apologized, and then she smiles because she knows that this is another kind of thing. We're making a film. You know, these are very subtle things, but I think that there's, at least for me, what making films allows me to do is move from a passive observer, and also it separates, I don't know, it creates a heightened experience for me as a maker, because I'm aware that I'm not the only viewer of what's there. And also the weight of the record, the documentary aspect, I think is really important, that what I am shooting right now could, if it makes the cut, could be important somehow. And so for me, it's a vehicle for my own sensitivity to the present moment. And I'll just say, I feel shy saying this, but and embarrassed a bit, but it almost feels like a kind of spiritual practice as well. It awakens me to what's so important in the now. So it sounds less academic, but I'm not a full-on academic. We were talking a lot about anthropology. I don't know if that's important in anthropology, but that's been important to me as a filmmaker.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's beautiful and wonderful, and nothing that I would be ashamed of, like I think that for many creators, that's what it is, that it's just a space to look at the world from this more attentive perspective. That's what I think it is. And you mentioned it like this idea of making something relevant or important, and I think that one of the things that I love about this film is that it's precisely about challenging what is important. And what you mentioned about how narrative, we're so used to these narrative-based stories where we're constantly pointed at what is important, like you need to pay attention to this because this will move the story forward. But in this case, we're not really pointed to that, you kind of need to figure it out yourself. And that sort of gives you this position where I need to ask myself, what is important here? Where do I want to put my attention as I watch this film? And in a way, I think that's what, like, the opportunity, you recalibrate the attention in the sphere of the film, but then once you leave the film, there's an opportunity to recalibrate your attention also to the actual world, which is, it's a beautiful kind of like conversation between both of them. And as like our magazine and our whole project is focused precisely in these intersections between ecology, culture, and spirituality, and we explore it through creative nonfiction. And I think that perhaps both your films, at first, they might not seem ecological, but when you take this very intersectional approach to ecology, then for us, what we saw in both these films is that they are stories about relationship to place, and there are stories about relationship to specific landscapes. So I guess as a final question to our conversation, what would you say was the role of place and landscape in your process of making these films? And we've been speaking about this a little bit, but was this something you were concerned with while making the film, or is this sort of something that emerges afterwards?
Maybe connecting this question to the previous question about contemplation. There were other films in mind, at least for Manakamana, that had made huge impressions on me prior to making the film, that were very much about landscape. Just a couple that come to mind are James Benning's film 13 Lakes, also another film called 10 Skies, but 13 Lakes in particular, I remember I'd never seen a film like it. I wasn't, it was one of the first films, the landscape film, I guess is one thing you could call it, a kind of avant-garde landscape durational film. I found it so liberatory to see that film, and transformative and beautiful. Again, 10-minute takes of lakes with the horizon fixed, and that was something that we worked to have too, that the camera was fixed such that the frame would be similar throughout. Another film is Larry Gottheim's film, I think from the early 70s, called Fog Line, which is shorter. I can't remember how long it is. Maybe it's 20 minutes long, but it's of a landscape covered with fog. You watch the fog retreat, and you see some horses and you hear birds sing. It's so simple, but the fact that landscapes are never fixed, they're always changing. It's just constant movement, even within a short time frame. So that kind of experience was, I find, joyful and exciting. And I think that the difference with Manakamana is that it's not only what you see in the landscape, and obviously there's repetition And sometimes they're facing toward the mountains, sometimes they're facing out. The weather is changing. But in addition to that, you have the perception of the spaces, which is further expanded by the passengers who understand the history of this place and who impart this only in piecemeal to us. Because another question I've often asked myself, and I really appreciated Nnenna's discussion of not wanting to subject her people she knew to, or entrusted her with working with them, to their horrors or their traumas. So having kind of a separation between the viewer and the people who are being filmed, I think that that's really important. You know, I've often asked myself, who am I to film this, and who are you to be able to see this? You know, these, if you're talking about human subjects with these histories that are, in my case, you know, I'm not from Nepal, and I'm sensitive to a lot of the people you see in the film are Dalit, they're untouchables, completely different life experiences. So I think, if anything, that they are the ones perceiving this and telling us bit by bit what they might know, but that it's not the full story, and that you hear a multiplicity of stories of the same space. So certainly landscape was a huge, and place. That part of Nepal, was a place I'd traveled through quite a bit, and where a lot of these people lived and traversed when they could. So definitely was a huge part of the film. I'll turn it to Nnenna. Thank you for letting me go first, though.
You're welcome. Yeah, I think for me, place and landscape were also very important. So part of the decision, I wrote about this in the intro text, so part of the decision to even make this film was getting to my apartment in Lisbon and seeing like this map of West Africa on the wall. And so also just thinking about, again, like placemaking and colonial placemaking. So it was a map of the coast, but with all Portuguese names. I guess it was like 15th century map. So what they had named places they passed by, including Lagos, which then led me to kind of look at the two places and what had happened between these two poles. So Lagos being one of the places they had visited, coincidentally also where I'm born, and Lagos in Portugal also being one of the, actually being the first port that enslaved people entered Europe through. I think it was also important in terms of, so not just this map on my wall, but making the film also depended on me being in Portugal and being confronted with all of these historical accounts. So it was also me responding to this place that I was now in. And I was interested in doing that, even though it was intimidating, from the perspective that, again, there is a lot of kind of commentary in the other direction of Europeans going to other parts of the world or Africa and commenting on like what they encounter there. So I was interested in the experiment of like, I'm going to respond to Portugal. But that said, I think I also realized in the making of the film that I had to separate kind of the actual spaces I was thinking about from, I don't know what word to give it, but there were the actual places, Lagos and Lagos, and then there were the places that I was creating kind of in the world of the film. So it was important to me to find stories of people going from one to the other. But then when I started thinking about filming, I think we had toyed with the idea at the beginning of like, or maybe I should go to Lagos and film, and then maybe I should go to Lagos and film. And it was important. And I actually did go to Lagos and look around and film things, and none of them really worked. So it was important along the way to realize that kind of the cities themselves and as they existed kind of in those months in 2018 was not really the film. Like, we're not the same spaces in the film. And so it was important to think about also that I couldn't just because it was documentary and nonfiction didn't mean that I had to go there and film, and that I would have to do some amount of like, I don't know if world building is the right sense, but I would have to do some amount of like creation that would make sense for the film and for the voices that I had. And I think that led to the decision I mentioned earlier of like listening to it with a friend and being like, okay, this is happening between the two cities, but it sounds like water, and deciding to film water. And yeah, in the end, I think the entire thing I ended up filming in Lisbon, actually. So neither of the two cities that the film is named about. But then I think, yeah, it was more important to focus on the space of water, which is kind of not nowhere, but not like geographical landmass, and decide that I would kind of build this, through water. I hope I've answered mostly. So yeah, I think space was important, but I realized there were many different levels of space.
And I think this is actually a nice way to start sort of closing at least this first part, is to say, and this is a lot of what we are addressing at Wimblu, is the fact that all our stories sort of emerge from a material world, our relationship to this material world. So it really doesn't matter like what the theme is in a way of the film. It's emerging from this material world and creates a relationship with it. But also, and Nnenna, this is exactly what you're saying, and I love it, is the fact that cinema in itself has this world-making ability. You sort of create a world in which like the viewers can enter and they can experience this material world in a kind of suspended way, I'd say, get to relate to it differently. And then you go back to the material world and it's not the same because you've watched the film, you've had this like different experience, this world experience within the film. And I think this sort of like coming in and out of film worlds, it's exactly what we're looking at, or just stories, these story worlds. They allowed us, they're kind of portals. I see it like this, they're kind of portals in which you kind of create this space to go from the same reality to the same reality, but with a whole different perspective. So I think this is really beautiful. Yeah.
I would love to ask Nnenna a question, if that's okay.
Please.
Because it's maybe related to what you were just saying, because I really enjoyed seeing your film. I'd actually not seen it, so thank you for sharing it with me. I was really curious about the underwater, the subterranean water shots. I found them sad. I found like a sense of longing behind them. They were beautiful, but it really changed my whole experience of the film. So I'm curious about, there's also there's archival footage, there are shots from above the water, but the underwater shots I was really intrigued by, and I was curious about why you chose them. I have my own interpretation of them, but I'd love to hear how you arrived at the underwater shots, because they're kind of a motif somehow as well in the film.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think when it came, so I had made the film just from the voices on subtitles, and then I'd had the conversation with some friends and thought, okay, this sounds like water. But I then spent like weeks shooting different kinds of water, and I wasn't still sure what that even meant. But I think ultimately I decided to try underwater because I don't know, I couldn't necessarily, some of it was practical. I wasn't necessarily going to recreate voyages. But I liked, once I added the Mamewata character, the idea of like her being underwater. Also, the idea that a lot of people have written and talked about of a lot of the lives that have been lost and a lot of the kind of witnesses that are in the water. And so I liked the idea of filming that. Practically also, I think I was thinking I don't necessarily, it doesn't seem worth it to do the journey from Lagos to Lagos myself, but I would like to capture some sense of like this having happened across the Atlantic. And so I mentioned it was shot in Lisbon. And so there is thankfully like an oceanarium in Lisbon, which they have these different waters. So they have sections with like the Atlantic, Pacific, etc. And so I just ended up spending, I think, 2 full days with my camera, just filming the oceanarium. I don't know if this is killing the magic of it, but then, which was interesting because I was just trying to look for shots that would match the film. And it was a nice experience because it was very crowded. There were all of these like school groups and kids, and there were a lot of fish, and I didn't really want fish in the film. So it was also a lot of just like trying to get like looking at this glass of water and trying to find little things that were magical and also avoid fish and people. But it ended up being, I think, a very meditative process for me also. And after the first day, I remember like going to look at the footage and just having a feeling after months and months of trying, like, okay, this is it. And like, this is what the film looks like. And then the overwater shots also, I had done a lot of filming on the water in Lisbon, and that didn't work either. But there was this one day that was very, very foggy. And this is when I got like the ship going across. It was so foggy that like it was foggy outside, but also like it fogged up inside my lens. And I remember that also working with the underwater shots because this was also in a way through water, through all of the fog and all of the condensation. And so I remember thinking, okay, yeah, these two work together. And it was a bit scary thinking, okay, now I'm going to make a 20-something minute film from looking at the oceanarium. But yeah, somehow it fit. And it worked to be kind of, a lot of the shots then was kind of looking through water, but also looking up at the surface of the water. And that seemed to work well as a perspective.
Thank you for sharing your tricks of the trade. I mean, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. The film.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I have two questions actually. So one, because I've seen your film a lot and I've also like shown it to my class once, and I think it's interesting that sometimes people miss that you're present in the car, and sometimes people miss it in a way that makes them very angry because they feel like they've been tricked because someone has just set a camera in a cable car and left. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering kind of, these are more personal questions, but I'm wondering how you deal with this feedback when it comes to you, and if you have a sense of why people assume you're not there. And then secondly, Alessandra mentioned you made the film about 10 years ago. And I'm wondering also how you look back on it after all this time.
Wow, thank you for those questions. Well, first of all, you're spot on. If people are angry, it's often, I mean, they're especially angry. The sense that they've been tricked, or that, some people have been angry because they find it so boring. And that one I'm okay with. But this one that they've been tricked, or that that I'm kind of amazed though that people could just assume that it would be filmed without people there. But that's okay. I get it. Not everyone has had the privilege to work with a film camera, or to they don't see it in the image, right? And that's okay. I think, I think it gets to the heart of what you were saying though about, people might miss the looks. They're subtle. I mean, and it's a slow film. I think I'm okay with that because I'm also somewhat allergic to moments in films in which the reflexive moment, in which the acknowledgement of the filmmaker or filmmakers is so present that it feels like an excuse for the film to say, oh, actually, I was here, I did this thing, they like me, and I feel like, what, it's not about us. This film is just not about me. I think that was important, that it be about looking. And also, I actually kind of, in some ways, to question why we are looking. Who are we to look? Why do we need? I think actually that discomfort is productive, because I think we could ask those same questions of any film, especially a nonfiction film in which there is such a gap in terms of either privileges or life experience between the people being filmed and the people watching, right? So I find it productive. That said, I'm also a very sensitive person, and I hate it when people are angry with me. So that's a little uncomfortable, and I don't have a very thick skin. So that's a bit more of a personal answer. I don't know how to handle that. I mean, I think at the time of making the film, what was most important was the film. And there's always this idea of a responsibility to an audience. And I get that, but I think that that can inhibit people from making strong work. If you're always so afraid of making people uncomfortable or offending people, or, you know, and then what are the standards that are dictating what makes people feel comfortable? You know, 10 years, 20 years from now, it might be very different, right? So that's a really great, I mean, I really appreciate you bringing that up. And then 10 years, again, it's been 10 years. I am so grateful for that film. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to make it and what enabled it. Not only, certainly foremost, the being able to spend that time with the people you see in the film. Not all of them, you know, like the three rockers. They're like the sons, one of them's a son of a friend, but, you know, so I didn't know them that well, but for the most part, everyone else I'd spent a lot of time with, and their lives have changed and my life has changed dramatically. I don't have the same freedom to come and go. I also know a number of them have died. That's really painful. And I'm grateful that they were filmed, because it has a different meaning for those communities, the people there. And I think for Nepalis, it has a different kind of meaning. I think, in which case, this is, again, the irony of this is that I had a kind of allergy to the idea of documentary as a record, or that it's there to document. But now I see the value of the film as a document, a historical and a personal document. So I really love that film. I'm really moved by it. I haven't seen it in a while, but whenever I see it, I'm just so moved by that film. So, you know, again, I see that it as a portrait, a series of portraits. And so it's super valuable to me personally, you know, meaningful to me personally. So I hope you feel that way about your film years later. I know you still, you know, I get it. We can be ambivalent about it, but hopefully you have that same sense about Lagos as well. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you both. I think, yeah, there's something so nice about like watching like documentaries through time, you know, just looking back at them. And what I love about both your films is that they're so open in a way. Like you can come in through so many places that they're very timeless in one way, and then in the other, it's also, as Stephanie, as you say, it's creating a document. You know, you can see it like that, but you can also, it's an experience that still works, you know, many years later. And I think that's one quality of any story, of any film, that it's one to value, you know, like can you come back to it 10 years later and still find sort of like this human experience of it, you know, that it's more universal. And I think that's the magic of not sticking to, as you were saying, Stephanie, to this sort of like essay form with an argument, you know, with a very fixed argument of what you want to say, but that actually just sort of letting go of control a little bit, that you're just kind of opening up the audience to this particular experience of this film world. And I think both your films are brilliant in that sense, you know, that they allowed you to come into this history and story at the same time, just sort of like this atmosphere. Yeah. I'm not sure, maybe if we have someone either here that would like to pose a question, and you can do it through the chat as well if you don't want to speak up. Or
I have a question.
Okay.
I want to make it for both of you. I am curious about what has been the response of these films in their places, like in Nigeria and Lagos, or Portugal, sorry, and Nigeria, and also in Nepal. What has been, I don't know if you know, like any comments or how people receive these films. I'm really curious about that.
I can start. My response is probably more anticlimactic. In Nigeria, I'm mostly shown it to my family. I think being my family, they've been very supportive. And then in Portugal, I made it in the context of like a documentary film program. So I had initially shown it then, which was like 2018. And it wasn't very, so there was one person who had helped me with the sound, Elsa, who was like, oh, this is a really important film. For the most part, I think it like, the form of the film pissed off a lot of my department. So there were a lot of arguments about how this isn't cinema because it didn't really have an argument. Like it's a lot of talking and it just leaves you somewhere. And there was a lot of frustration also with the fact that I didn't like physically travel somewhere. There was a lot of frustration that a lot of the kind of demons I mentioned that I was fighting through the film. I think partly as a result of the like of that, I didn't show it then for a very long time. So I made it in 2018 and got a resounding like, this is terrible, this isn't cinema. And I didn't show it until this year. So I had shown it at the beginning of the year in January. And then also now through Wimblu. And so it's been interesting, kind of, yeah, that I made something 5 years ago when I was trying to figure out what kind of films that I make. Since then, a lot of films I make are like this, but I think just because of all of the negativity, I had like hidden it away. But it's been interesting, like dusting off the cobwebs and showing it to people and having people now in different contexts connect with it and see what I was trying to do. And so maybe I should retry to show it in Portugal now. Sorry, there's a ambulance going past. I don't know if you can hear that, but yeah, I would say it's been a very biased response, but that's been the feedback.
And then as for Manakamana, gosh, so when it was on the festival circuit some time ago, again, 10 years ago, I'm trying to remember, so I'll have to explain a personal note. I had just given birth to a child. I didn't travel with it as much at a certain point. And I know that it premiered, it did play in Nepal, and there were 2 Nepali Time reviews. One was written by a Nepali author, and it was mostly positive. There was another by an anthropologist who skewered it, who just hated the film. I think he was offering a kind of corrective to the first review. But more locally, at least the response that I've received to all of my films that I made in Nepal is that they're pretty slow, at least by the participants. I think they kind of wished for a little bit more action maybe. But now I was back in Nepal this past summer. I actually took my son and we visited a lot of the homes where I'd done a lot of the earlier filming and of those families, and they'd lost all of the copies of the film. So I sent them more copies of the film. So I think they see them as portraits, as documentary for their families. So I'd say mostly positive response. On a positive note, I remember I found a site where you could, I myself was looking for a film, like an art film, but I couldn't find a copy of it. And I saw a pirated copy of Manakamana that was circulating amongst Nepalis. So I took that as a good sign.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you both for the answer. Yeah, it will be interesting also to see or to know more about the response of Lagos in Nigeria. Like I'm curious about that too. But it's we hope Wimblu can be a window for people to see it there whenever they want. But I think that even though you are not making the film to get a positive feedback, is interesting to get the feedback from the places you are working. So I thank you for the answer.
Actually, if I could respond to that, I think that's really important. What you were saying, though, I would be appalled. I'd be pretty upset if the response in Nepal was mostly negative, because I don't wish to offend, a country that's not my own home or the people living there. So I would say that while I might not care about like a generic audience, in some ways I really do care, especially about the people who are in the film and the participants. And I'm really glad that it stands as a kind of document of their family members.
Mm-hmm. I think it also speaks about how vulnerable a process filmmaking is, that it just, it really takes bravery and fighting demons, like Nnenna said, and, putting yourself out there. And then maybe you don't, like as Stephanie, you said, you don't need the thick skin, because you want to remain sensible and sensitive, and that's exactly what you want. But it really takes, I think, some special sort of like receptivity in a way, this openness to the world. Again, you need to be open both to the world that you're filming and then to the audience that you're like interacting with, and you are this sort of mediator in a way between like different realities. So it takes some diplomatic skills.
And if I can add, I think, again, with sharing anxieties about showing films to the people you make them amongst, I would say another thing that I think about often is either showing it and people are confused and don't necessarily understand what the project had been. So like the idea of having it still be accessible to whoever is in it, but also showing it and having people. I once heard somebody talk about if when you're making portraits of people that you've done a good job if it's still your portrait of the person, but they can recognize themselves in it and kind of be like, okay, I see how you saw that. So I think my two biggest anxieties is that one, I show something and it doesn't make any sense to the people who are in it, or that I show it and they don't recognize themselves as I've depicted them. And maybe that is why I often kind of show my films to extended family, because nobody in my family is anything kind of related to art or film or even academia. So it's also nice that I show it to them and they're like, okay, like, yeah, we see something here. Or show it to, if I film people, which I don't often do, but then they're like, okay, I see what you were doing, whether or not I agree with it, then it feels okay.
But I really like what you're sharing, because it goes back to the topic of intersubjectivity. And it's really, that's what you're doing when you're like making a film, you're sort of building these relationships. But I would also comment, Nnenna, on what you just mentioned, that the fact that, and this is something I think Stephanie mentioned, that we're so used to these sort of narrative-driven, auto-explanatory stories, that when we meet something that it's like appealing more to your senses and your attention and like this more contemplative approach to it, then most people sort of like have this first reaction that, what do I do with this, But at the same time, I think they're so important, to have these film experiences that are not about telling you what to think or telling you exactly what the interpretation of the whole thing is, and to approach film not from what was it about, but more about what did it do for me, what was my experience of this film. I think that's a very important thing to nurture. Yeah.
If you want to support our project, you can share this episode, visit our digital magazine wimblu.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Patreon community where you can access exclusive content starting at $3 a month. Your support allows us to create and share content that reimagines a fair and healthy world for all life forms.